Mountain biking isn't cheap, and whether you're new to the sport or maybe just on a more restrictive budget, the thought of spending more than $1,000 on a bicycle can be a bit hard to swallow. But I'm here to tell you today that you don't have to. And in this video, we're gonna look at 5 trail-capable hardtails that you can get out the door for less than $1,000. And for each one of those bikes, I'm gonna tell you what I love about them, what you might want to think about replacing on them down the road, and most importantly, who I recommend those bikes for. When making this list, I used 3 criteria to choose the bikes that are on the list, as well as rank them from my number 5 to number 1 pick. And those are the same criteria that I use whenever I'm going out to buy a bike for myself. The first and most important thing that I look for and that I suggest you looking for when you're buying a mountain bike is the frame quality and geometry. I'm looking to make sure that there's no outdated headset, bottom bracket, or axle standards, and also making sure that the geometry that the frame has is in line with what the bike is designed for. The next thing that I'll be looking for is part spec, and this is huge when we're talking about value bikes. We're gonna see which of these companies was able to cram the most amount of value into their bike for less than $1,000. If the bike comes with things like an air-sprung fork, tubeless-ready wheels, and maybe a nice wide-range drivetrain, that's just less stuff that you're gonna need to think about replacing down the road. The third and final criteria that I use when choosing these bikes is brand reputation and serviceability. If you're buying one of these value hardtails as your first mountain bike, having a bike that you can go and buy from your local bike shop, as well as have them service it and maintenance it, is going to be huge. And even if you're a hardened MTB veteran, things like a solid frame warranty from a respectable brand sure doesn't hurt. And speaking of well-respected brands, let's go ahead and kick that list off right now with bike number 5, and that is the Giant Talon 1. The Talon is Giant's XC-oriented entry-level hardtail, and the level 1 build is the highest tier that you can get it in, and is gonna set you back $990. This bike is available with either 27.5-inch wheels or 29-inch wheels, depending on the size. And so with that, you're gonna get some different chainstay lengths to match the different wheel sizes. It's great that Giant has kept in mind smaller riders as well as riders on the other end of the spectrum when designing this frame, and not trying to fit riders of every size onto the same rear end of the bike. It's also great that Giant has future-proofed this bike with full internal cable routing, including routing for a dropper post should you choose to add one down the road. What's not so future-proof, however, is the quick-release dropouts that come on both the frame and the fork. That will make it a lot harder to upgrade to a higher-end wheel if and when you ever choose to do so, or maybe you damage the hub that comes with the bike. I mentioned earlier that the Talon is an XC bike, and that's reflected in the pretty steep 68.5-degree head tube angle. This will make the bike feel really agile and nimble on steeper climbs or going through tight rocky sections, but will make it feel a little less composed at high speeds. Speaking of composure, or maybe lack thereof, one dig that I have to give the Giant is that it only comes with 100 millimeters of travel up front, and actually on the size extra small and small, you're only gonna get 80 millimeters of travel. I am, however, thankful to say that that is gonna come from an air-sprung fork. Giant makes a lot of their own in-house forks that they spec on their entry-level bike, and the XC32 that comes on the Talon 1 is a pretty solid fork for the money. Drivetrain is taking care of Shimano's Dior 10-speed drivetrain, which has an 11 to 42 gear ratio, which isn't bad, but you may find that that 42-tooth cob will be a little tough to get up some of the steepest climbs. The Talon does come with hydraulic disc brakes, which I think is kind of a non-negotiable when it comes to a legit mountain bike that you want to take out on the trails. And these ones are in the form of the Tektro M275. I've actually ran these on an old bike that I had before, and they're not the best, but again, for a bike under $1,000, I really don't think you can complain, and we're actually gonna see these brakes come up on a lot of other bikes on this list today. One spec choice that I'm pretty bummed about on this bike is the wheel choice. First and foremost, they're not tubeless ready. So if and when you wanted to set your bike up for tubeless, meaning you don't have to worry quite as much about punctures, your bike's gonna be a little bit lighter, you would actually need to get an entirely new wheel or at least an entirely new rim to run it. The internal width on that rim is actually just 21 millimeters, and that's also gonna make it harder to run bigger, say 2.5-inch tires that you might wanna run if you're doing a little bit more aggressive riding. But what the Talon may lack in some of the spec choice, it more than makes up for in the fact that it's coming from such a well-respected and well-known brand, Giant. You can find a bike shop that carries Giant in just about any small town across the country and even internationally. They're one of the bigger brands in cycling, and they actually manufacture a lot of frames for many other smaller companies too. And this is a huge plus if you're thinking about one of these bikes as your first mountain bike. Ordering a bike online and having to do some of the assembly at your house with your own tools can be intimidating. And speaking of tools, if you don't have those tools yet, doing your own service and maintenance can be hard. So buying a bike like this giant Talon from a bike shop is a huge perk. The bike also comes with a great warranty. You're gonna get a 1-year warranty on aesthetic stuff on the frame, things like decals and paint, but you're gonna get a lifetime warranty on that frame against any kind of manufacturer malfunction. If things start to break earlier on than they should, you'll get a free replacement frame from Giant, and that's really awesome. So who is this Giant Talon 1 for? Well, first and foremost, it's for an XC rider. It's for somebody who wants to either go and race cross country or maybe just wants to ride more mellow trails. The geometry and the smaller travel fork that this bike comes with is not gonna make it great for going and taking on super technical or steep or fast rides. I'd also say that the Giant is aimed at a beginner who's looking to buy their bike from a bike shop. As we'll see as we get later on this list, there are more XC focused bikes that do provide a bit of a better value, but you're not gonna have the serviceability of having a very well-known brand at a bike shop right in your town, potentially. So if that description sounds like you, great, this bike could be your next ticket. But if not, don't worry, because we've got 4 more great bikes to look at on this list today. Coming in at number 4 is the cheapest bike on our list today, coming in at just $729, and that is the Rocky Mountain Soul 10. Now, that price I just gave you is actually a sale price. Usually it lists for $910, but we're talking about last year's model. They didn't really make any huge changes on the 2023 model, so if you're looking to get a rad deal on a pretty capable trail hardtail, then this is absolutely the bike to buy, and you better buy it now before these sale bikes run out of stock. Just like the Giant we talked about, this Rocky Mountain Soul does have an aluminum frame that's internally routed for all your cables and hoses, including a dropper post. Unlike the Giant though, this Rocky Mountain has a 66-degree head tube angle, which means in theory you could build this up to be a much more capable kind of trail light enduro bike should you choose to do that. Another thing that speaks to the more aggressive nature of this frame is the pretty short seat tube. The size large is just 445 millimeters long, and what that lower seat tube will do is allow you to move that bike underneath you a little bit more, especially if and when you were to put a dropper post on there. It also has a quick release dropout in the back as well as the fork, but for $730, I feel like you can't really fault Rocky Mountain for that. At the front of the bike, there's an SR Suntour XCM34 fork. This is a coil sprung fork, which essentially means that you're not gonna have the same adjustability on this guy as you would if it was an air fork. The coil spring that's in there is gonna be the exact same whether you're 120 pounds or 250 pounds. So that's gonna make the bike a little less adjustable and may mean that you wanna replace that fork a little bit earlier on than you would if you had an air spring in there. In terms of drivetrain, Rocky Mountain has chosen to spec this with Microchift's 9-speed drivetrain that has an 11 to 42 tooth range. So again, not the widest range. You might want to think about upgrading that to a 10-speed or even 12-speed range down the line, but it should be enough to get you going. I'm also thankful that this Microshift 9-speed drivetrain does have a clutch mechanism, which should prevent the chain from falling off and getting all the loud chain slap from that chain hitting your chain stays. The Rocky Mountain does have hydraulic disc brakes. They're called the Clark's M2. I'm not familiar with that brand. I have heard of them being spec'd on other cheaper bikes, so I can't speak to how well they perform, but they'll definitely be a lot better than the mechanical alternative. I'm thankful to say that the wheels on here are tubeless compatible, so if you did want to switch to tubeless, all you'd have to do is just buy new tires. So we're talking about a $100 or $120 upgrade instead of a $500 upgrade, so that's great. Moving on then to brand reputation and serviceability, Rocky Mountain is a very well-respected brand. They've been in the industry for a long time, and there's lots of local bike shops where you could probably pick this thing up in person. So who is the Rocky Mountain Soul 10 for? Well, if you're on a super tight budget, the $730 price tag on this bike is gonna be hard to beat. And even though it's that cheap, I definitely think this is an upgradable frame. I would not hesitate to throw a nicer fork on here, a nicer drivetrain, maybe put a dropper post on there. So all in all, if you're looking for a great trail hardtail that's gonna be honestly one of the most versatile bikes on this list, then you really cannot beat the Rocky Mountain Soul 10. But let's say you're looking for something even more aggressive. You don't want to just do the occasional Black Diamond trail ride. You want to take it to a lift access bike park or do some downhill racing on it. then this next bike is the one for you. And as you might have guessed, we are talking about the Marin San Quentin 1. This is a very special bike. I've actually done some videos on this new Marin San Quentin before that I'll put down there in the description if you're interested in it. But one of the most special things about it is it's really the only aggressive hardtail that you can get for under $1,000. The Marin San Quentin is just $999, and for that you're gonna get a super slack 64-degree head tube angle with a 130mm SR Suntour XCM 34 fork on it. And you could easily go ahead and put a bigger 140 fork on there and slacken that thing out even more, making this bike have the potential to seriously rip. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. One thing that really bums me out about this bike is that it does still come with quick release dropouts. But unlike the other bikes on this list, it actually has the boost standard of quick release. It's called QR141 or 141QR on there. And that's gonna make it pretty hard to find a replacement wheel should you end up blowing yours up, taking it off of a real big drop or a real big jump. With the exception to that though, this frame is an awesome first frame. It's got a super low seat tube, lower than anything else on the list and really anything else on the market right now. The size large seat tube is only 375mm long, which should make it super easy to bust real big whips and tables, but should also make it easy for kids or someone with a smaller inseam to be able to get on and off the bike and ride comfortably without worried about getting caught up on the top tube. Moving on to the spec choice, I already said that this does come with an SR Suntour XCM 34 fork. This thing is coil sprung, so just like the Rocky Mountain we talked about earlier, you're not gonna be able to tune that fork to suit you and your riding style, but it does come with through axles up front, which means that it should be easier to upgrade your wheel if you chose so and still use that same fork. The San Quentin 1 actually has the exact same drivetrain as the Rocky Mountain Soul. It's that 9-speed Advent drivetrain with the 11 to 42 range, and it's got the same Tektro hydraulic brakes as the Giant we talked about at the start of this video. I'm super stoked to say that this is the first bike on this list that I would say comes with a pretty legit set of wheels. It's got sealed hubs, tubeless ready rims, and an internal width on those rims of 29mm, which means that you can spec wider tires even up to 2.5, 2.6, maybe 2.7 inches if you really want to push it, and still be able to use those same wheels. And speaking of wheels and tires, I think this is by far one of the best looking bikes on this list. I love the tan wall tires. I mean, if you bought this bike and took it out to the bike park to ride, no one would think you're on a $1,000 bike. It honestly looks mint. And speaking of mint, the San Quentin 1 has a pretty solid warranty as well. You're actually gonna get a lifetime warranty on that frame, which is gonna be great for all you huckers out there who are gonna take this bike out and try to keep up with your buddies who are on full-on downhill bikes. And that's exactly who this bike is made for. People who are looking to take an entry-level hardtail that they can still keep up with and maybe even beat their friends who are buying full suspension bikes that cost over 5 times as much. If you're more into blasting jumps and racing downhill than you are in racing back up the hill or going on a long, slow, leisurely ride, then the San Quentin 1 is most definitely the bike for you. We are now down to the top 2 bikes on this list, and honestly, both of these bikes are pretty dang rad, and I had a little bit of trouble picking which one I wanted to put at the number 1 spot. We'll get to that bike in a little bit, but first, let's talk about my number 2 recommendation, which is the Cannondale Trail SE4. This bike is another one of those guys that's on sale right now. It usually lists for $1,175, but right now you can get $200 off that price for just $975. And that's a screaming deal, as this is by far the highest quality frame that we've had on the list so far. The biggest reason for that is that it's the first frame to have boost through axles in the back. That makes this bike super future-proof. You could upgrade that wheel, you could put a wheel on there that costs more than your entire bike did and not have to worry about any kind of dropout compatibility. As you probably guessed, the frame is fully internally routed for your brake, your derailleur, and your dropper post, should you add one. And I honestly think that this is probably one of the best looking frames on this list. It definitely doesn't look like it costs less than $1,000, and that's great. The geometry on this bike is best suited for kind of aggressive XC riding or light trail riding. Nowadays, a lot of people call that down country riding. It's got a 66.5-degree head tube angle and a relatively average, maybe on the higher side, stand over height and seat tube, with that seat tube height coming up to 470mm on a size large. Just like pretty much every bike on this list, the SE4 comes with an SR Suntour fork. This one in the form of the coil sprung XCR32. Again, it's a coil fork, which makes it less adjustable, so that's probably a part that you're gonna wanna replace down the road. Just like the Giant we talked about at the beginning of this video, you're gonna get the Shimano Deore 10-speed drivetrain with an 11 to 46 range. You'll also get those same Tektro hydraulic M275 disc brakes. Unlike the other bikes we've talked about on this list so far though, the Trail SE4 has some really dialed wheels. You're gonna get WTB tubeless ready rims with a 25mm internal width and some sealed Shimano hubs. Once again, the fact that this bike does come with tubeless ready wheels means that it's super easy to set it up as tubeless if and when you choose to make that leap. And with a frame as dialed as this Cannondale is, I definitely think it would be worth investing that little bit more. And speaking of investment, one of the things you're definitely paying for when you buy this bike is the brand reputation and serviceability that comes from Cannondale. If you want to buy a bike from a trustworthy local bike shop that's going to be able to assemble it for you, service it for you, and just help cater that experience, then the Cannondale SE4 is a great option for you. It's also going to come with a lifetime warranty on that frame, which is awesome, and a 1-year warranty on any kind of paint or decal issues. So who is the Cannondale Trail SE4 for? Well, probably a bit more cross-country oriented rider who maybe wants a bike that's going to be more aggressive than the Giant that we talked about before. This Cannondale really is a good all-rounder bike, and the fact that you can get it from a local bike shop definitely raises the value in my book. Now, before I spill the beans on the best hardtail that you can get for under $1,000, I just want to give you guys a quick reminder, if you haven't already, to go ahead and like this video and subscribe to this channel. Subscribing will make sure that you don't miss cool things like our next video, which will be the first 5 upgrades that you should make to your value mountain bike. In addition to that, subscribing also just helps out our channel, so thanks for doing that. And now that that's out of the way, let's go ahead and reveal that #1 hardtail for less than $1,000, which is none other than the Polygon Xtrada 7. Polygon is an Indonesian brand that's been making huge waves in the downhill and freeride side of mountain biking for the last decade or so. But that doesn't mean that they've forgotten about the rest of us. And the Polygon Xtrada 7 that retails for just $999 is, in my opinion, the epitome of what a value hardtail can be. Starting with the frame, the Xtrada 7 does have through axles in the back, and I've talked about that already a lot in the video, but essentially that just makes it much more future-proof should you want to upgrade it down the road. It's also one of just 2 bikes on this list that does have wheel size that changes with the size of the frame, meaning that smaller riders will get a smaller wheel set, which is going to make the bike fit your size just a little bit better. Finally, the cable routing on this thing is fully internal, including routing for a dropper post, and this frame is rad enough that I definitely wouldn't hesitate investing the money to throw a dropper post on here if that suits your riding style. And speaking of riding style, this is another bike that I'd put in that kind of light trail or down country category. It's got a 67-degree head tube angle with a 120mm fork and a seat tube length that's 470mm on a size large. So while that's far from the most aggressive bike on this list, I feel like it should be enough for most of you to handle most of the riding that you do on a bike like this. I am super thankful to say that 120mm fork I just mentioned is air sprung and does fit a boost through axle up front as well, so you really shouldn't need to worry about upgrading or changing that fork out anytime soon. They've actually managed to spec a 12-speed Deore drivetrain on this bike. That's a drivetrain that's not uncommon to find on bikes that cost $2,000 or $3,000, so it's crazy that you're gonna get this for less than $1,000. It's also got the Shimano MT201 hydraulic disc brakes, which again, you would expect to see on a lot pricier bikes, and super dialed wheels that are of course tubeless ready, have a through axle, and have really high engagement. What that means, if you're not familiar with that term, is that there's gonna be less slack when you go to pushing your pedals before your wheels start spinning. Your cassette's gonna engage right away, which is something that I really enjoy and makes the bike feel a lot higher quality when you're riding it around. So the Xtrada 7 has one of the best frames on this list. It definitely, no question about it, has the best part spec on this list. But the one thing that might steer some of you away is that you can't actually just walk into your local bike shop and buy a Polygon. They're only sold in the US through Bikes Online, and if you're outside of the US, through other online retailers. So that means that it's gonna get shipped to you kind of pre-assembled in a box. The assembly that you'll have to do at home isn't too extensive. You'll have to put on the handlebars, put on the wheel, the pedals, but you won't have that support from a local bike shop. So if you're looking at this as your very first mountain bike, that's definitely something to keep in mind. Finally, the Polygon Xtrada 7 does have a pretty decent warranty. You're gonna get a 10-year warranty on that frame against any kind of manufacturer defects. So who is the Polygon Xtrada 7.4? Well, I did put it at the top of my list, which means it could be a pretty dang rad bike for any of you guys, but more specifically, someone who's looking to get a mountain bike and maybe lean a little bit more towards that cross-country side of the spectrum. It's also by far the bike that I'd recommend for somebody who's maybe looking to get a second bike. Maybe you already have a full suspension bike, but you want to get a more cross-country oriented hardtail. This is the bike for you for sure. Mountain biking is an awesome sport, and it's been so rad to see it grow over the last few years, and I'm thankful that there's brands like Polygon, Cannondale, Marin, Giant, Rocky Mountain who are making really dialed mountain bikes for less than $1,000. Honestly, any bike on this list would be a super solid option for you to go out and buy, but there are pretty significant differences between each one. So make sure you do your homework, maybe go and try some of these bikes out if you can before purchasing one and see which one fits your riding style best. Please go ahead and let me know in the comments if you've got any more questions about any of these bikes. Again, the only bike that I've personally ridden on this list is that Marin San Quentin, but I'll do my best to research it and kind of apply my knowledge of mountain bikes in general to help answer that question. If you've got any other value hardtails that you would recommend to the viewers of this video, drop those in the comments as well. While you're down there, please go ahead and hit that like button and hit the subscribe button. Then go out there, grab your mountain bike, whatever it is, head out for a trail ride, and hopefully I'll see you out there.